I signed the deed on a wet Tuesday in March. The notary's pen scratched across paper in that tiny county office as the rain tapped against the windows like fingernails. The property had passed through 7 names in 20 years, but none had stayed more than a season. Still, I thought little of it at the time. I was drawn by the price, absurdly low for a stone-built cottage in the Vermont hills, and by the name attached to it, the Norridge place. I knew that name. Everyone in the county did. They'd been lumber barons in the 1800s. Their crest still lingered above the rustic gates, a pine tree cleaved in half by an axe. I'd driven past that gate many times as a child, always curious but never brave enough to peek in. No, it was mine. The keys jingled in my coat pocket as I arrived, tires skidding slightly on the moss-lit gravel. The cottage looked even older up close, with its weather-beaten shutters, pale lichen creeping up the stones, and a single cracked dormer window like a blind eye watching the driveway. There were no neighbors nearby, only thickets of pine and a crumbling trail that led nowhere in particular. The air smelled of cold rot and wood smoke, but not unpleasantly so. I remember thinking this could be home. I had been between jobs, between cities, and half-heartedly chasing the dream of becoming a novelist. Solitude seemed like a solution. Inside, the place was almost entirely unfurnished, except for a grandfather clock that didn't work and a framed needlepoint on the kitchen wall reading, "The order maintains us." I chuckled at the absurdity of it. The air inside was dry, the floors uneven but clean, and a few bees lazily drifted against the kitchen window. I spent the day dusting, sweeping, and mentally planning where the desk and shelves would go. By evening, I had rolled out a sleeping mat in the front room and was warming canned soup over a camp stove. A normal day, if not for one thing. There were only 2 bedrooms. The listing had said 3. I double-checked, walked the perimeter twice. Upstairs had 2 visible bedrooms and a bath. The second-floor hallway ended with a narrow wall between 2 doors, as if something had once stood there. It felt off. I tapped on the wall. Hollow, then not. The echo shifted halfway through. I followed the seams of the molding and found what looked like the outline of a door frame, long painted over but unmistakable. A room had been sealed, not by collapse or decay, but by deliberate effort. My mind went immediately to logical explanations: black mold, structural instability, some kind of legal quirk. But my chest was tight. I couldn't shake the impression that the wall was watching. That night, I dreamt of tapping. Not the rain, not the clock. A sharp, rhythmic knock from behind a wall. I woke to silence and darkness and the sudden awareness of just how far I was from anyone else. Over the next few days, I settled into the strange quiet. I began cataloging the cottage's oddities, the way the air was colder near that wall, the faint scent of beeswax and dried lavender that seemed to linger in the second-floor hallway, the closet in the master bedroom that had dozens of rusted wire hangers but no rod. I found an old letter beneath a floorboard near the hearth, half consumed by mildew and time. Most of the ink had faded, but a few words survived. She must not wake. The bloodline binds. Time does not forgive. The handwriting was tight and formal, as though the writer had learned penmanship under duress. On the 5th day, I met the first person since moving in. A man in his 70s was parked at the end of the lane in a rust-colored truck. I approached cautiously, but he rolled down the window with a friendly nod. "You're the new owner," he said flatly, as if already certain. "Name's Eli. Used to do groundskeeping here." I asked about the cottage, about the missing room. His face tightened. "Best not to go digging. That house remembers things." I laughed uncomfortably. "Did something happen in the sealed room?" "It wasn't always sealed," he said. "Just after Ruthie died." I asked who Ruthie was, but Eli only shook his head and stared out at the woods. "You see anything strange? You let it be. Don't go knocking." Before I could press further, he drove off, tires crunching softly behind him. That evening, I stood in front of the sealed wall again. A memory surfaced, something from childhood. My grandmother used to say that silence in the wrong places was a kind of scream. That's what this wall felt like, a scream held in so long it had become stone. I placed my hand against it. The wood felt colder than it should have been, almost wet. I thought I heard something deep and muffled, like breath held just behind the surface. I stepped back, made tea, opened my journal. That's when I noticed the pattern. Each time I wrote in my journal since moving in, the ink in certain spots would bleed. Just a word or two. Always the same, Ruth, inside, listen. I hadn't written those words. I spent the night in the front room with the lights on. By morning, the air in the cottage had changed. I can't explain how I knew, but I did. It had begun. Something old and buried had stirred the moment I entered that house. I had bought a cottage. I had inherited a silence. And now the house wanted to speak. The morning after the ink bled in my journal, I found myself unable to write anything new. Every word I tried to commit to the page appeared normal until I looked back at it seconds later. Then somehow they seemed rearranged, twisted into different phrases, or erased entirely. I sat by the window with a lukewarm cup of coffee, watching the light bend oddly as it filtered through the cottage's warped glass panes. The trees beyond the window stood as still as monuments. It was as if the world outside the house had paused, just slightly out of sync with time. I tried to reason it out. Maybe mold in the walls was messing with me. Maybe the isolation was playing tricks. But when I returned to the hallway upstairs, that same coldness prickled my skin. It emanated from the sealed wall like breath against the back of my neck. The outline of the door was clearer now, as if the paint had thinned overnight. I stood there for minutes, hand hovering just above the surface. I knocked once, sharply. The sound barely echoed. Nothing knocked back. Later that day, I explored the attic. A trapdoor in the upstairs ceiling led to it, partially obscured by cobwebs. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight, and a thick layer of dust coated everything. Boxes, broken furniture, old trunks. It smelled like old cedar and something fainter metallic. Tucked in the far corner beneath a slanted beam was a narrow shelf, and on it, a glass jar with a red wax seal. It looked untouched by time. No label. Just a faint smudge where someone may have once written something. Curiosity overcame hesitation. I pried it open, expecting stale air or old herbs. Instead, the jar was empty, visibly, tangibly empty, but the moment I removed the lid, a scent filled the attic. Lavender and ash. The same scent I'd noticed downstairs. My vision blurred for just a moment, and a high, thin sound, almost like a child humming, curled inside my ears before vanishing. I resealed the jar immediately and backed away from the shelf, nearly stumbling over a small wooden chest behind me. Inside the chest, I found papers, scraps of handwritten notes, receipts, a child's drawing of a crooked house, and beneath it all, a leather-bound journal with the name Ruth Norridge inscribed faintly on the inside cover. The pages crackled as I turned them. Most were blank or water-damaged, but several entries remained legible, written in an uneven, slanted hand. October 3rd, they say she talks in her sleep again. But I never see her mouth move. They say to keep the door closed and not to answer when she sings. But it's Mama's voice sometimes. It's hard not to listen. October 9th, Papa brought another jar. Said it's to quiet the room. He made me press my thumb into the wax. Said it would remember me. I don't want to be remembered by that thing. I don't want it to know my name. October 14th, Mama says the order is watching. She says we must keep the door sealed. But it still knocks at night. It always knocks 3 times. That was the last clear entry, before the ink bled into illegibility. I closed the journal slowly. My pulse pounded against my temples. There was no mention of what or who was in the sealed room. But there was something. There had been something at least once. Something they tried to silence with wax, memory, and fear. I carried the jar and the journal downstairs. As I placed them on the kitchen counter, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. The needlepoint on the wall, "The order maintains us," seemed suddenly less quaint and more like a warning. That evening, I returned to the local records office in town. The clerk remembered me from the sale and was reluctant to speak, but I coaxed a few leads from him. The Norridge family had indeed been prominent, even aristocratic in local terms. Their wealth came from timber, but rumors of occult leanings had dogged them for generations, particularly a branch known for their association with a group called the Order of the Still House. I found no official mention of such an organization in the archives, but older town meeting minutes from the 1940s included vague references to private rights and community preservation efforts by families with ancestral responsibilities. It was deliberately obscured language, paper shields for something darker. On my way home, I stopped at a local cafe. An older woman named Miriam, who overheard me asking about the Norridges, approached my table. Her voice was low and uncertain. "You're living there?" she asked. "In the house?" I nodded. "I was friends with Ruth," she said after a long pause. "When we were girls." "Before?" She trailed off. "Before what?" "They changed," Miriam said. "The family, her father especially, started building things in secret, sealing parts of the house. Ruth said they were hiding someone, but she never said who or why. Then, one day, she stopped coming to school. A few weeks later, the paper said she died from a fever. But I don't think that was true." I asked what she thought happened. Miriam shook her head and whispered, "Some doors aren't supposed to be open." When I returned to the cottage that night, it felt like the walls were breathing. The old grandfather clock in the hall, which hadn't moved a hand since I arrived, now ticked softly, though the pendulum remained still. I went to bed exhausted, heart unsettled, and dreams thick with that same humming sound from the attic. In the dream, I stood in the hallway again, in front of the sealed door. This time, the paint peeled back on its own. I reached for the handle. It was ice cold and pulsed beneath my fingers. I turned it, but the door didn't open outward. It sank inward like melting wax, and from behind it came a girl's voice, hoarse and calm. "You open the jar." I woke gasping, soaked in sweat. The clock had stopped ticking. The jar was no longer on the counter. It sat on the floor beside my bed, its seal freshly pressed as if someone or something had touched it again. This time, the smudge on the glass was clearer. A single fingerprint. Not mine. The cottage no longer felt empty. Something had awakened. Not a ghost. Not exactly. Something older, something patient. I had taken the jar from its hiding place. I had read her name, and now she knew mine. It was still dark when I woke again, though I wasn't sure I'd ever truly fallen back asleep. The jar sat in the exact same place beside my bed, but the wax seal had split slightly, as if it had cracked under pressure from the inside. My first instinct was to throw it out, to toss the thing into the woods behind the cottage and never look back. But something stopped me. Not fear exactly. Something more complicated. A pull subtle and coaxing, like a whisper carried on wind I couldn't quite hear. I picked the jar up and turned it in my hands. The smudge, the fingerprint, had faded. In its place, I noticed a faint etching on the inside of the glass. 3 vertical lines scratched so lightly it was nearly invisible unless caught in the right light. 3. Downstairs, the grandfather clock had resumed its ticking. I hadn't wound it. I never even touched it. I stood in front of it, waiting for the sound to falter, for the spell to break, but it ticked on with perfect cadence. I tried to ignore the sensation that it was ticking in time with something else, something slower and deeper, like a heartbeat under the floorboards. The jar remained in my hand. I returned it to the attic. I sealed it again with wax from an old candle I found in a kitchen drawer, then tucked it back on the same shelf. As I did, I caught a faint glimmer of movement in the far corner of the attic, only for a second, gone as quickly as it appeared. There was no one there, just the heavy air and the scratching of mice in the walls. But my skin didn't believe that. It itched like I'd been stared at. That morning, I took a hammer to the sealed door upstairs. I don't remember deciding to do it. One moment I was sipping coffee and rereading Ruth's journal. The next, I was in the hallway with my sleeves rolled up, striking the wall at the seams. The sound was deafening in the still house. Plaster cracked, flakes of paint dusted my arms, and the hollow thud of the wall gave way to something deeper as I broke through to the other side. Behind the false wall was another door, smaller than I expected. Narrow, no knob. It was covered in carvings, circles intersecting with angular lines, a spiral etched at eye level, and beneath it, a phrase gouged in tight script, "She does not forget." There was no dust on the carvings. No cobwebs. The wood looked polished clean, as though someone had been maintaining it from the other side. I didn't open it. I stood there for what felt like hours, my hand hovering above the center spiral. It radiated warmth, the way a stone does after sitting in sun. I pulled back. I told myself I needed more information. I needed a reason, a justification. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid. That night, the knocking began. I had just extinguished the lights and settled beneath the quilt when I heard it. 3 knocks. Deliberate. Measured. From upstairs. Not the sharp rap of wood expanding or settling, but the unmistakable sound of something or someone knocking on a door. I froze. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 more. Then nothing. I couldn't sleep. I lay stiff, listening, waiting. Hours passed. At some point, I must have drifted because I woke to find the needlepoint in the kitchen had fallen from the wall. The glass had shattered. I picked it up, heart quickening. The backing had split open in the fall, revealing something hidden behind the fabric, a yellowed photograph curling at the edges. It showed a young girl, maybe 11 or 12, with hollow eyes and a crooked smile. The caption on the back read only, Ruth, October 1929, the same year the journal ended. Her eyes unsettled me, not because they were sad or empty, but because they weren't. They looked knowing, watchful, like they had already seen what would happen. I needed to get out of the house. I packed a bag and drove into town. I told myself I'd stay at the inn for a few nights, maybe visit the Historical Society and look through their archives. But when I checked into the room and unpacked, I found something impossible in my bag. The jar. The wax seal intact. I had not brought it with me. I was certain. That night, I returned to Miriam's cafe. She was there again, alone this time, drinking weak tea by the window. When I approached, she didn't look surprised. "You heard the knocks, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded. She exhaled sharply, staring at her tea. She always knocks in threes. Always has. First the mind, then the memory, then the name. "What does that mean?" I asked. She looked up, and her eyes were glossy with something between fear and sorrow. She remembers everyone who forgets her. That's what they believed. That's why they sealed her away. It wasn't to protect her, it was to protect themselves. I asked her what Ruth had done. What could justify sealing a child inside a room? She knew things, Miriam said. Things she shouldn't have. She could hear the dead. Not just speak to them, she remembered them. All of them. She spoke in voices that weren't hers. They said she was possessed. But I don't think that's what it was. I think she was a vessel. A keeper. The Order thought they could control her. But they were wrong. And when she stopped obeying, they made her a part of the house. I sat in silence for a long time after that. The drive home was quiet, but not peaceful. The woods felt denser, closer to the road, like they had shifted while I was away. I pulled into the driveway just after midnight. The cottage windows glowed faintly, though I had turned off every light when I left. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it, except the door upstairs. It was open. Just a few inches. Just enough to reveal the edge of the darkness within. I didn't go up. Instead, I sat in the kitchen with the journal, the photograph, and the jar on the table before me. The wax seal pulsed faintly in the lamplight. I could feel something waiting. Ruth Norridge had been locked away nearly a century ago, but she was still here, and she was no longer waiting to be found. She was inviting me in. I stood at the bottom of the staircase, staring up at the crack of darkness beyond the door. It hadn't been ajar the day before. I had left it sealed, untouched after chiseling the false wall away, and now it stood open just wide enough to suggest invitation, or perhaps a warning disguised as one. The warmth I had felt on the spiral carving earlier was gone, replaced by a dense cold that settled in my lungs and bones the way a thunderstorm settles in the gut long before the sky opens up. I didn't want to go up there, but I also knew the door wouldn't remain half open for long. The house or Ruth, or whatever will have been sealed inside that room for nearly a century, had grown restless. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and slowly ascended the stairs. Each step creaked louder than usual, though I moved slowly, deliberately. The cottage seemed to hush around me, like it was holding its breath. At the top of the landing, the air changed, thicker, almost humid. The light from the hallway refused to spill past the threshold. The spiral-carved door was still open, just slightly, the darkness behind it unmoving but not still. I pushed the door open with the back of my hand. It swung silently inward. Inside was a room far smaller than the dimensions should have allowed. It was as if the architecture had folded inward, compressing space into something denser, tighter. The walls were covered in carvings, hundreds of them, circles, spirals, runes I didn't recognize, and symbols layered over one another as if years of hands had etched into the same spaces again and again. The floor was wooden, but worn nearly smooth. At the center of the room sat a low iron-framed bed, child-sized, with no mattress, just a rusted frame and a quilt that looked hand-stitched and ancient. A doll rested at the headboard, its eyes painted shut, its mouth an X of thread. Everything smelled faintly of lavender, ash, and old blood. Then I noticed the jars. Lining the perimeter of the room were dozens, maybe more, of glass jars, all identical to the one I had found in the attic. Each was sealed with red wax, and most bore faint, smeared labels. Names. Each one was a name. Some I recognized from local gravestones. Others felt old, biblical, or foreign. A few had only initials. They were arranged carefully, deliberately, as though part of some unseen system. I reached toward one, the nearest, labeled J. Thorne, but stopped short when the air seemed to resist me, pressing against my hand like invisible molasses. That's when I heard her. A girl's voice no louder than a breath. Not that one. I froze. The flashlight flickered, dimmed, then steadied. I turned slowly toward the sound, but the room was empty. Yet I knew in a way that bypassed logic entirely, that I was no longer alone. Ruth was here. Not as a ghost behind me, not as a memory etched into the house. She was the room, the carvings. There. And she was awake. The whisper came again, stronger this time, as though inside my mind. Not that one. That one remembers. I stepped back, hand trembling, and accidentally brushed the shelf. A jar tipped. I caught it just in time, but the wax seal cracked slightly. The scent of iron and honey spilled out for a moment, and with it, a sound like soft weeping. I resealed it quickly, hand shaking. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked aloud. The silence returned. Then, behind me, the doll on the bed shifted. Just slightly. Its head tilted. "You came," the voice whispered. "You brought me back." "No," I said, heart pounding. "I found the jar. That's all." "You remembered," Ruth said. "And that's all it takes." The floorboards beneath me groaned, not with weight, but with movement, as though something below the house had stirred. I backed out of the room, pulling the door closed behind me. It didn't resist. But as it clicked shut, a gust of cold air burst from the cracks around it, and I heard a final whisper, distant and calm. "You can't unknow me now." Back in the kitchen, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I wrote down everything, the room, the jars, the voice. But the words blurred on the page. The ink pooled oddly again, forming a slow swirl that mirrored the spiral on the door. I turned to Ruth's journal for answers, flipping through the fragile pages. Near the end, I found an entry I hadn't noticed before. It was dated October 17th, 1929, 3 days after her final intelligible note. "They say I am not Ruth anymore. That I am what remembers Ruth. That the memory of me keeps them bound. I don't understand, but I feel them inside the jars. All their thoughts, all their regrets. They whisper through the glass when the moon is high. I think I am meant to carry them. I think I already do." The words sent a chill down my spine. If Ruth had become a vessel for memories or spirits or something worse, then what had I brought back when I opened the jar? The thought that each jar contained a consciousness, bound, preserved, stored like some archive of the dead, filled me with unease I couldn't put into words. I considered leaving again, but a small, treacherous part of me didn't want to. The house was awful, yes, terrifying, but it was alive in a way no place I'd ever lived had been. It responded to me. It revealed things to me. And somewhere, underneath the dread, I felt a thread of wonder, horrible, mesmerizing wonder. I made tea, sat by the window, waited. Just past midnight, the knocking resumed. 3 knocks, then silence, then the humming. It was louder this time, an old lullaby slightly off-key, drifting from behind the walls. I recognized the tune. My grandmother had hummed it. A slow, sorrowful thing about a house at the edge of the wood, where the moon never set and the children never grew older. I opened the front door, needing air, and found a small package sitting on the porch. No footsteps in the frost. No car tracks. Just a box, wrapped in yellow twine. Inside it was another jar. No wax seal. Just a name scratched into the glass, mine. The jar was light. Too light for something that made my hands tremble the way it did. I turned it over slowly, watching as the light from the porch bulb refracted through the imperfect glass. It was old, blown by hand, the rim uneven, the bottom clouded. The name etched across it, mine, was rough, jagged, as though scratched in with something blunt and angry. I wanted to believe it meant nothing, that it was some mistake, some sick prank. But I couldn't. Deep down, I knew. The house had been speaking. It had chosen. I didn't take the jar inside. Not right away. I placed it on the porch railing and stepped back, watching it like I expected it to move on its own. The air was still windless, but the trees creaked softly in the darkness. My breath came in short, visible clouds. I stood there for over an hour until the chill seeped into my bones and the porch light flickered out. Only then did I bring the jar inside, carefully, reluctantly, and placed it on the kitchen counter beside the others. Except it wasn't beside them. I blinked. The other jars, Ruth's, the one from the attic, the one labeled J. Thorne, were gone. The counter was bare, save for the newly delivered one. I checked the shelves, the attic, even the sealed room. Nothing. Not even dust rings or smudges. It was as if they had never existed, and only mine remained. I didn't sleep. I sat at the table and stared at the jar for hours. I tried to write in my journal, but the words slid off the page like oil on glass. I tried recording a voice memo on my phone, but the audio playback was blank. Only silence. The cottage had begun erasing my attempts to document it. Or worse, it was only allowing what it wanted me to remember. By dawn, I had made a decision. I would leave. Not tomorrow. Not later. No. I packed in a frenzy. Clothes, books, Ruth's journal, my laptop. I left the jar on the counter, refusing to even look at it. I didn't care if it was part of the house or some tethered to Ruth or to something older. I just knew it wasn't mine, no matter what the etching said. But when I got to the car, the key wouldn't turn in the ignition. It didn't stick or jam, it simply wouldn't move, as if the mechanism had turned to stone. My phone had no signal, no bars, and every number I tried to call resulted in silence on the other end. The weather app, which had worked the day before, now read, "You are here. There is no forecast for you." I stood in the driveway, breathing heavily, willing myself not to panic. Then I heard it again, knocking. 3 sharp raps. But not from the house. From behind me. From the trees. I turned slowly. In the edge of the forest, where the underbrush grew thick and the trees leaned too closely together, a figure stood. Small. Thin. A girl in a white dress, stained to the hem, with dark hair hanging loose over her shoulders. She didn't move, didn't speak. But I knew her. Not from life. Not from any memory. But from the journal. From the dream. It was Ruth. She raised her hand and pointed, not at me, but at the house. Then she turned and walked into the woods. Slowly, steadily. Her feet made no sound, her dress didn't rustle. It was like watching a projection slide across the trees. I should have run. I should have driven the car into a ditch if I had to. But I followed her. The woods were cold, but not in a natural way. The air grew still and heavy as I passed beneath the boughs, and the colors around me dulled to grayscale. Every step felt muffled. The forest had become a room, a sealed room, and I was walking deeper into it. Ruth never looked back. She led me to a clearing where the ground dipped into a shallow bowl. At the center was a circle of stones, half buried, surrounding a wooden platform no larger than a child's bed. On it sat another jar, larger than the others, sealed with black wax. It pulsed slightly in the dim morning light. Ruth stood beside it. When I stepped closer, she spoke. Her voice was not a whisper this time. It was clear and heavy, layered with something beneath it. They gave me to the house. Now the house gives you to me. I shook my head. No, I'm not part of this. You are, she said. You knew my name. You read my words. You opened the door. I looked down at the jar. There was no name etched into it. Just a swirl. A spiral. The same symbol carved into the door upstairs. Ruth reached out and placed her hand on the lid. The wax cracked, and the air changed again, sharper now, full of voices just beneath hearing. They weren't speaking words, but memories. Arguments, lullabies, prayers, screams. Dozens. Hundreds. The air filled with them, and they rushed toward me like a wave. I fell to my knees. Ruth stepped closer. She knelt beside me and whispered into my ear, "You carry them now." like I did, until you find the next. I wanted to scream, to cry, but no sound came. My body felt distant, my limbs heavy. I was sinking into the ground, into the air, into the house that lived beneath the trees. Then I woke, back in the cottage, in my bed, fully clothed. The jar was on my nightstand, the wax seal gone. Inside, a spiral had been etched along the inner glass. I picked it up, and the sound of voices returned, faint, overlapping, just beneath perception. I couldn't leave now, because I understood. The jars didn't contain the dead. They contained what the dead couldn't carry anymore. And now they were mine. I didn't open the jar again. Not because I had any sense of control or restraint, but because I didn't need to. Whatever was inside it, inside me now, had already begun to seep through. The voices weren't constant, not yet. They came in swells, faint when I focused on mundane things like washing dishes or boiling water, loud and fraying at the edges when I sat still and listened too hard. They were not violent. They didn't demand. They simply remembered. Endlessly. The memories had no names, no clean source, just a flood of emotions that didn't belong to me. A woman grieving over a lost son. A man begging for absolution in a language I didn't recognize. A child whispering about fire behind the walls. And always, beneath it all, Ruth. The spiral on the inner glass of the jar pulsed faintly when the memories stirred. I began to notice changes in the house. Small, cumulative details I couldn't account for. A set of handprints on the bathroom mirror, small, like a child's, though I lived alone. A bowl of lavender placed on the mantel, though I hadn't bought any. The radio in the living room, unplugged for days, began to hum faintly around dusk, cycling through static and what sounded like a sermon in reverse. But what disturbed me most was the mirror in the hallway. It had warped. The glass didn't reflect the room as it should. Instead, it shimmered slightly, as if showing a version of the house just slightly off from mine. In that version, the front door was always open, and the lights never turned off. I spent more time in the sealed room upstairs. I couldn't help it. The room welcomed me now, the air thick but less hostile. I cataloged the jars. Not by name, they'd all vanished or changed, but by sound. Some hummed like old laments. Others buzzed like a hive disturbed. One pulsed in complete silence, which somehow felt louder than the rest. I began referring to them as archives, because that's what they felt like. Not prisons, not containers, but storage. Memory preserved in wax and glass. And I unwillingly, inevitably, was becoming their caretaker. It was in that room that I first heard the term. Archivist. Whispered, not spoken, from behind one of the walls. I don't know which jar it came from. The word repeated once, then silence. But after that night, I found it carved into the baseboard near the bed. The archivist keeps what time rejects. I returned to town again, driven by a need to know more about Ruth, about the house, about the so-called order. I visited the county library and asked to see the local archives. The clerk, a tired man with a scowl etched permanently into his face, directed me to the basement, where old records were kept on microfiche and rotting file boxes. It was there I found the article, Norridge Girl Missing After House Fire, October 1929. The piece was short and vague. It reported that Ruth Norridge had been presumed dead after a fire damaged the east wing of the family home. No remains had been found, but the family had declared her lost. A follow-up a week later noted that the fire damage was less than initially reported, and that some parts of the house remained sealed as per the family's wishes. No mention of burial. No obituary. Just silence. I asked the clerk about the article. He glanced at the headline, then at me. "You're living out there." I nodded. He closed the file without another word. Back at the cafe, Miriam wasn't there. A younger woman behind the counter told me she hadn't shown up in 2 days, and no one had heard from her. The sense of isolation pressed in deeper. The cottage wasn't just isolating me physically, it was separating me, subtly and efficiently, from everything outside it. When I returned home that night, the porch light was on, though I'd unscrewed the bulb days ago. A jar sat on the top step. This one was different. Not glass, but ceramic, glazed in black with red etchings along the rim. There was no wax seal. No name. I picked it up, expecting the same pulse, the same low hum of memory. But there was nothing. Just silence. I brought it inside and placed it beside the others. The moment it touched the shelf, the other jars quieted. All of them. The hums, the weeping, the whispers, they stopped. The room felt still in a way that was unnatural. Not peaceful. Suspended. That night, I dreamed again. I stood in the hallway of the cottage, but everything was reversed. The staircase led down from the second floor into an infinite basement. The kitchen cupboards stretched floor to ceiling like library stacks, and Ruth stood in the middle of it all, taller now, older, her eyes silvered over. "You're keeping them," she said. "But you don't understand them. I didn't ask for this," I told her. "No one asked," she replied. "They're chosen. The ones who listen. The ones who don't look away." In her hand, she held a jar. My jar. The one labeled mine. She turned it slowly, then opened it. A wind erupted from the glass, rushing through the hallways like a living thing, scattering papers, ripping the walls to shreds. And then, just as suddenly, it reversed, sucked everything back in, including me. I woke on the floor of the sealed room, the black ceramic jar beside me. It was open, but not empty. Inside, etched along the inner walls, was a single sentence repeated over and over. "He keeps what time rejects." That morning, I noticed something else. My journal, the one I'd been using since I moved in, was filling on its own. Entire entries I hadn't written. Dates I hadn't lived. Descriptions of people I'd never met. Some were written in languages I couldn't read, but the handwriting was always familiar. It was mine. I had become the archivist, and the house had become my memory. The mirror in the hallway changed again. Not gradually, not with a slow warping of its reflection, but in one distinct moment. I was passing by with a cup of tea when I caught movement, mine at first, then something else. I turned slowly and stared into the glass. My reflection stared back. Same face, same posture, same tired eyes. But the hallway behind it was wrong. Reverse, yes, but also older. The wallpaper was torn. The light flickered. And on the opposite wall, one that in my house was bare, there was a painting I'd never seen. A portrait of a girl in white, her eyes covered with a linen cloth. The reflection blinked. I did not. I dropped the tea. The mug shattered across the floor, and steam curled up around my feet. But the reflection didn't react. It just stood there, blinking slowly, until I stepped away. When I returned later with a towel and broom, the mirror had returned to normal, or what now passed for it. My face mirrored mine. My movements matched, but I still felt watched, as if I were the copy, and the thing inside the glass was something older pretending to be me. I stopped looking at mirrors after that. The black ceramic jar refused to speak. Unlike the others, it didn't pulse or sing or whisper. It simply existed, a dead weight on the shelf that seemed to suppress the others by its presence alone. I didn't know if that meant it was stronger or emptier or something entirely different. But the sealed room felt colder now. Less haunted, somehow, and more preserved, like a church that had been stripped of its congregation and left behind for dust and ghosts. I began to forget things. Small things at first, where I'd left my boots, which rooms I'd already cleaned. Then stranger absences. I'd find items I didn't remember owning, a child's handbell in the kitchen drawer, a set of worn slippers by the hearth, a dusty gramophone in the front closet playing songs I'd never heard before. One night, I opened the pantry and found it stocked with food I hadn't purchased. Old brands, tins with faded labels, a sack of flour with a manufacturer date from 1931. I touched the bag. It felt warm. I started dreaming of the house again, but it wasn't my house anymore. It was the mirror house, the one from the warped glass in the hallway. The walls were darker, the wood rotting, and the air filled with a hum of unspoken names. In the dreams, I wandered room to room, finding versions of myself already there, sitting, sleeping, sometimes whispering to jars, sometimes crying over them. They would look at me and smile, sadly, as if I were always meant to join them. In one dream, I found myself standing in a mirror, looking out at my real home. My reflection, the one from the warped hallway mirror, stood on the other side, mimicking my every move. But then it smiled. I hadn't, and it stepped away from the frame while I remained trapped inside. I woke gasping, my hands pressed flat against the cold hallway wall. That day, I discovered the locked door in the basement. I've been in the basement many times before, mostly for storage, sometimes to escape the presence of the jars upstairs. But the door wasn't there before. I was sure of it. Tucked behind a wall of cracked shelving and rusted tools, it stood plain and narrow, with no knob, just a small brass keyhole, old and corroded. Above it was a word etched into the stone arch, vault. The key was nowhere to be found. I searched every drawer, every shelf, every crawl space. I even tore apart the grandfather clock, suspecting it might hide something. Nothing. But the more I searched, the more I began to feel that the key was not an object to be found. It was a memory I hadn't yet remembered, and the house was waiting for me to remember it. That night, I returned to Ruth's journal. It had begun to fill again, too. Pages I hadn't read now appeared between older entries. Some of them were mine, written in my hand. Others were Ruth's, or what I believed to be hers, but dated far after her supposed death. March 2nd, the mirror version walked today. I saw her enter the kitchen. She didn't knock. She just moved. I don't know what she wants. Maybe to be real again. Maybe to remember me before I forget myself. March 3rd, the vault calls. I hear it in the floorboards, in the silence between the jars. I think the key is not metal. I think it's me. I didn't sleep. At 3:03 a.m., the same time the jars had started humming the first time, I stood in front of the mirror again. I looked at myself. This time, I did not move, but my reflection did. It raised its hand and pointed down, to the basement. The next morning, I found the cellar door ajar. I hadn't left it that way. The keyhole to the vault now glowed faintly, as if backlit by something from within. I pressed my hand against the brass. It was warm. The door did not open, but something on the other side moved. I placed my ear against the wood and heard it, a sound not like knocking or breathing or whispering, but the turning of pages, slow and endless, as if an enormous book was being read by a presence with infinite patience. I whispered, "What are you?" The answer came not in words, but in feeling. Grief, longing, hunger, the sensation of waiting through centuries in silence, knowing someone must come, and that someone would be me. I backed away. I didn't open the vault, but the memory of it followed me, into every room, into every reflection. The mirror in the hallway no longer showed anything. Not me, not the house, just the door. Always the door. And soon I would have to open it. The vault door whispered to me in dreams. Not with words, not even with voice, but through presence. Heavy, still, waiting. I felt it whenever I closed my eyes, an outline in the darkness behind my eyelids, a silhouette of something vast and unmoving that waited beyond stone. I awoke each time with the same thought pounding against the inside of my skull. You're already holding the key. I had searched the house. Every drawer, every jar, every memory. I'd even searched the pages of Ruth's journal backward, forward, diagonally. I'd flipped through the pages of my own notebook, which now recorded events I hadn't lived. Notes in my handwriting describing rooms I'd never entered and people I'd never met. One entry stood out. It had appeared the night after I first touched the vault. March 5th, the key is not forged. It is recalled. Buried in the jar that bears no name, beneath the silence that breathes. You will remember it when you stop searching. The black ceramic jar. I hadn't touched it in days. It had remained on the shelf in the sealed room, untouched, unspeaking. But now I understood. It didn't silence the others because it was stronger. It silenced them because it was emptier. It waited to be filled, not with a voice, but with recognition. I went to it at dusk. The sealed room had darkened early that evening, as though the light outside had agreed to dim itself in respect. I lit a candle and placed it on the floor beside the jar. The ceramic felt cool in my hands, heavier than I remembered. I turned it slowly, looking again at the red etchings that wrapped around the rim, glyphs, maybe, warnings. A spiral repeated again and again until it bled into a single unbroken line, disappearing into it. I stared into the jar's open mouth. Nothing. No hum. No light. No memory. And then I remembered. Not an object. Not a story. A moment. I was 6 years old, visiting my grandmother's house. She had lived alone on the edge of the town cemetery, in a crumbling yellow cottage with lace curtains and an iron stove that rattled when it boiled. One day, I wandered into her attic while she napped. I remember the heat, the dust, the way sunlight cut through the grime on the windows like golden knives. I found a small box there, tucked inside a chest wrapped in a crocheted blanket. Inside the box had been a key, brass, bolt, with a spiral worked into its bow. I had pocketed it. No reason why. No theft in the act. Just a child's curiosity. I never told anyone. I never found a lock it belonged to. It had moved with me over the years, unnoticed, migrating from junk drawer to sock drawer to a cardboard box marked sentimental crap I kept in the back of my bedroom closet. I left the sealed room, went to the bedroom, dug out the box. The key was there, exactly as I remembered it. Brass, spiral, cool to the touch, despite the warmth of the room. I stood in the basement that night with a key in one hand and a candle in the other. The door pulsed faintly behind the stone arch, as though recognizing me. I slid the key into the hole. It fit. Of course it did. But I didn't turn it. I stood for nearly an hour, palm pressed flat against the metal, feeling the deep thrum of something on the other side. A memory. Presence. Maybe even Ruth. Or what Ruth had become. The thought clawed at me. What if opening the door didn't release something, but completed something? What if I wasn't unlocking a prison, but accepting a role? The archivist. A keeper of what time rejects. A servant of remembrance. The jars had been growing again. I hadn't placed them there. I hadn't collected them. But each morning, new ones appeared along the shelves of the sealed room. Glass, ceramic, metal. Some humming, some silent. All sealed. All nameless. I began cataloging them in a book I didn't remember starting. The book grew in thickness as if it too remembered things I hadn't written yet. Page numbers in the 300s. Descriptions of dreams I hadn't dreamed. Names I had never heard of followed by arrived in a date. I tried one last time to escape. I packed a bag, drove the car to the edge of the forest road, past the cracked wooden sign that still read Norridge Path, and kept going until I hit a gas station on the county line. The air felt clearer there. The light less weighted. I bought a coffee, looked in the mirror of the restroom, and saw someone else. Not a stranger. Me, but younger. Hollow. Waiting. And behind me, on the stall door, someone had scratched a spiral. I turned the car around. By the time I returned, another jar had appeared on the doorstep. Smaller than the others. Frosted. Inside, a folded piece of paper. I opened it. 5 words, in a tight looping script I recognize now as my own. It is time to turn. I returned to the vault. Key in hand. Mind quiet. This time, I turned it. The lock gave way without resistance. The door creaked open on hidden hinges, revealing stairs that led not down but in, like descending into a wound that the house had never allowed to heal. The air inside smelled of cedar and earth and old blood. The light did not follow me. Still, I descended. Behind me, the door closed, and above me, the house exhaled. The door closed behind me with the quiet finality of a tomb being sealed. There was no click of a lock, no gust of displaced air, only a silence so thick it felt almost wet. I stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The air was colder here, but not with the chill of damp earth or moldy stone. It was the cold of time long undisturbed. The kind of stillness that didn't merely linger, but pressed in. I descended slowly, my hand trailing along the rough stone wall for balance, each step echoing into the dark with a sound too hollow to be natural. It wasn't that the stairs were steep. It was that they seemed to stretch longer than they physically should have, like I was being drawn not down, but deep. After what felt like far too long, the stairway ended in a flat stone floor. The chamber I stepped into was circular, as wide as the cottage above it, with a domed ceiling that seemed to bend the very light downward. At its center stood a plinth, waist-high, made of the same black stone as the vault door. On top of it sat a single object, a mirror. Oval-shaped, framed in tarnished brass. It did not reflect me. Around the chamber's edges, shells had been carved directly into the stone walls. Upon them rested jars, dozens, maybe hundreds, each one identical in size but varied in material. Glass, bone, onyx, silver, clay. Some were sealed in wax. Others were bound in chains or wrapped in faded fabric. But none had names. Not even the faintest scratch of identity. I recognized them anyway. I had dreamed some of these jars. I had held them in memory. They were the ones I hadn't seen in the sealed room upstairs. The ones that existed beyond remembering. I stepped toward the mirror on the plinth. As I approached, the surface shimmered, not with light, but with motion. It rippled like disturbed water, and within it, I saw a version of the room. But instead of me, there was Ruth, or what remained of her. Her hair hung loose, tangled, her skin gray like ash, her eyes unblinking. She sat in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the same jars, but they pulsed softly with light in her presence. She didn't speak. She simply lifted her hand and placed it flat on the mirror's surface. I hesitated, then mirrored the gesture. The glass was warm, and then I was no longer standing in the chamber. I was in her memory. It unfolded around me, seamless and silent. I stood in the parlor of the Norridge house, though it was brighter, newer. The walls were clean, the wallpaper intact. A fire crackled in the hearth. Ruth sat at a piano, her back to me, her fingers moving silently across the keys. Around her stood 5 figures dressed in long coats and veils. The order. Their faces were blurred, impossible to focus on, as though memory itself refused to hold them clearly. One stepped forward and placed a jar on the piano. Ruth stopped playing. She turned and looked directly at me, though I wasn't really there. They told me I would forget, she said. But I didn't. I kept them all. The memory twisted. I was in the upstairs hallway now, the day they sealed the door. Ruth screamed from behind it, not in fear but in fury. Someone, her father I thought, held his hand against the wood while others chanted behind him, murmuring in a language I didn't know but understood in the marrow of my bones. She pounded on the inside, then silence, then humming. It wasn't a ritual to contain her. It was to contain what she had become. I pulled back. The mirror darkened, and I was again in the chamber beneath the vault. The jars were humming now, low, resonant, like a choir of bees in mourning. I turned from the mirror, breathing hard, my skin damp with cold sweat. The plinth had changed. Where the mirror once sat, there was now a book. Leather-bound, cracked with age. No title. Just a spiral embossed in the center. I opened it. The pages were filled with names, line after line, column after column. No dates, no stories. Just names. Some familiar. Most not. About halfway through the book, I found my own. It wasn't a surprise. Not anymore. I had known since the first knock on the wall that the house had chosen me. The book was only the confirmation. But below my name in smaller script, there was a second entry. Archivist in transit. I didn't know what it meant. Not exactly, but it felt like a warning. Or a promise. I closed the book and turned toward the shelves. The jars were vibrating now. Not violently, not threateningly, but in rhythm. A signal. They were ready. I picked up the nearest one, sealed in green wax and wrapped in burlap. The moment I touched it, an image flooded my mind. A woman in a rain-soaked garden, burying something beneath a weeping willow. Her hands bled. She whispered the same sentence over and over. He was mine, but the house took him. I saw her face. I knew her name. And then the image faded. I placed the jar on the floor at the room's center. One by one, I gathered others, laying them around me like a ritual. I didn't know what I was doing, but my hands moved with purpose. The memory guided me. Or maybe Ruth did. When the last jar was in place, the floor began to hum. Not the house. Not there. The memory. It was coming alive. The mirror on the wall flared to life again, and this time it showed not Ruth, but me. Older. Tired. Sitting in the sealed room upstairs, surrounded by jars. My mouth moved in the reflection. "You're almost ready," I said, and then the glass shattered. Darkness fell. Not the absence of light, the presence of something else. Something final. I woke on the floor of the vault. The air was different, denser, heavier, filled with the acrid scent of burned dust and aged paper. My candle had burned out, but I could still see. Not with light, not exactly, but with memory. The walls glowed faintly with the residue of what had happened, what always happened here. Echoes. Not sound, but presence. Each jar on the shelves hummed now in irregular pulses, like breathing from another plane. I could feel them watching me. No, just attention. Endless attention. I stood slowly, my limbs aching, as if I had been lying there for days instead of hours. The plinth was gone. The mirror, shattered into dust. The book of names had vanished too, as though it had never existed. But the spiral remained. Not embossed, not etched, but formed in ash on the floor where I had laid the jars. It turned inward, layer upon layer, into a center that did not exist, a vanishing point. I knelt and touched it. The ash was warm. When I opened the vault door and stepped back into the basement, it was no longer mine. The shelves had multiplied. Floorboards I remembered were gone, replaced with slick stone. The staircase led upward into light, but not the one I knew. The door at the top was wider, older. The frame was carved in symbols I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then climbed. When I emerged, I was still in the cottage. But it was different. The angles were wrong. The shadows stretched too far. The air tasted of iron. The furniture was familiar but rearranged, like someone had tried to reconstruct my life from vague memory. The needlepoint on the kitchen wall now read "The Archivist abides." The humming of the jars echoed from the floor beneath my feet. I stepped outside to find the world altered. Not by time, by recollection. The trees were too tall, the sky too still, and the gravel drive no longer led to a road, only more trees. I was inside the memory of the house. It had remembered itself in full, and in doing so had pulled me deeper. For days, or what passed for days, I wandered through rooms I didn't recognize but knew instinctively. A nursery with a cradle that rocked on its own. A dining room with 13 chairs, each carved with a different face. A study filled with ledgers I couldn't read, though my hands moved over the pages like they understood. In one room, I found a painting of the house, but the windows in it showed faces looking out. My face among them. It was not a haunting. It was a becoming. One morning, I think it was morning, I woke to find a jar beside my bed. Not placed gently, but dropped. The wax was cracked, and the scent it released was cold soap and pine resin. When I touched it, I remembered a boy I'd never known. His name was Caleb. He had drowned in a frozen lake in 1903 after wandering away from a holiday service. I saw the moment through his eyes, the eyes splitting, the pale light through the water, the sound of a hymn fading above him. When the memory ended, I was weeping. The house was no longer testing me. It was feeding me, or perhaps merging. I was the archivist now, not by title, but by function. I found the mirror again, or a mirror. It stood in the parlor, where the piano used to be. Its surface was no longer reflective but translucent. I saw other archivists moving behind it, dozens, maybe more, all in different houses, different eras, but always the same jars, always the same spiral. Some were old, some were children. One looked exactly like Ruth. They did not see me. I saw one write something on the mirror's surface with a finger dipped in ink. She never left. The image faded. I began hearing the house speak, not in voices, but in moments. Footsteps when no one was there, humming in harmony with silence. Doors closing to protect me from something I could not yet understand. The house was remembering more than just the people. It was remembering itself, its original purpose. A repository, a reliquary, a vault for memory too dangerous to let die. I entered the sealed room again. It had changed. No longer a child's bedroom. It had become a cathedral of recollection. Jars floated inches above the ground, turning slowly, their contents glowing softly. In the center stood a figure. Ruth, but not as I remembered her. She was ageless now. Not young, not old. Her dress had fused with shadow, her eyes silver and unreadable. "You stayed," she said. "Most don't." "I couldn't leave," I replied. "There is no leaving, only forgetting." She turned and gestured to the jars. "You've seen what we keep, but you don't yet understand why." I didn't respond. "They're not prisoners," she continued. "They're stories that were meant to be erased. Voices too heavy for time to carry. This house, it remembers because no one else will. And me? I asked. You were chosen, she said, because you tried to forget something once. Something you weren't meant to forget. Do you remember now? I didn't, but the spiral burned behind my eyes. You will, Ruth said. When it's time. She vanished. Not like a ghost, more like a page turning. The sealed room folded in on itself, becoming just a room again. But the jars remained. I cataloged them, one by one. 4 hours, maybe days. Some opened themselves to me, and I learned their stories. Others resisted, but I recorded them anyway. And then, one night, a knock, 3 times, on the front door. I opened it. There stood a girl. Wide eyes, muddy dress, holding a jar. This is yours, she said. She placed it in my hands. The label read only, what you forgot. Inside, something moved. Not a memory. Truth. And it was waking up. I sat at the kitchen table with the jar in front of me. It was smaller than the others, with clear glass and no wax seal. Inside, something stirred. Not visibly, there was no movement to the eye, but I felt it. Like a low, internal vibration, an awareness pressed against the edges of containment. The label, What You Forgot, was written in my own handwriting, though I didn't remember writing it. The letters trembled slightly, as if written with a hand not entirely steady. I didn't open it. Not immediately. I just stared, heart beating a rhythm I hadn't felt since I entered the house that first night. Outside, the world remained still. Too still. The trees beyond the kitchen window no longer swayed. The sky didn't shift. There was no sun, no moon, just a gray, endless veil. The house existed now outside of time, a boundary place, anchored by memory and will. And something was pulling at that boundary from within. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the jar, waiting for a sign or a whisper or even the knock. But none came. The jar simply waited. At some point, I stood, walked into the parlor, and lit the fireplace, not for warmth, but for light. The shadows in the room had been thickening, pressing in. I needed something to hold them back. The flames burned steadily, but gave off no heat. Only a soft sound like pages turning in a quiet room. Ruth didn't come. The sealed room remained closed, the jars within silent. The humming had ceased. I was alone with the jar and the thing inside it, my forgotten memory. I thought back to what Ruth had said. You tried to forget something once. Something you weren't meant to forget. The sentence clung to me like a burr, irritating and sharp. I had spent days, weeks even, remembering others' lives, taking on their pain, their stories. But I had never asked why the house had chosen me specifically, why it had called me, why the jars came to me. I had accepted it because I had to, because survival in the cottage meant surrender. But now the surrender was over. The spiral had completed its circle, and the jar before me contained the answer. I picked it up. It felt warm. When I opened it, there was no dramatic flash, no rush of wind, just a single, breathless moment of stillness. And then the memory hit. Not a vision, not a dream, a return. I was 9, standing in my childhood bedroom, staring into the mirror above the dresser. It was late. My parents were asleep. The house was silent, but I could hear a voice, soft, humming, not outside, but within the mirror. A girl's voice. She sang a lullaby I didn't know, her face faint in the glass. I wasn't scared. I remember being curious. I remember asking her name. She said, Ruth, and then she asked for something. Not a promise, not a secret. She asked me to remember her. She said, one day, they will try to bury me again. You have to keep me alive. Just a little piece. Hide it somewhere safe. In yourself. I nodded. I don't remember what happened after that. The memory snapped shut. I was back in the kitchen, trembling, breath caught in my throat. The jar on the table glowed faintly now, its glass warm with the resonance of what had returned. I had known Ruth long before the cottage, before the sealed room, before the order. Somehow, impossibly, she had found me in childhood, through a mirror, through time, and planted herself there, buried in the folds of memory like a dormant seed. I had forgotten. because forgetting was part of the ritual, part of the protection. But the house had always known, and so had she. I staggered into the hallway. The mirror there had changed again. It no longer reflected anything. It was black glass, slick and endless. At the center was a single spiral, drawn in fog from the other side. I pressed my hand to it, and it pulled me through. I was standing in the sealed room. But it wasn't how it looked now. It was the room as it had been decades ago, furnished, warm, a child's room. A little bed, shelves of books, drawings on the wall. Ruth sat on the floor, hair in braids, humming softly as she arranged her dolls in a circle. She looked up at me. "You remembered," she said. "I think I always did," I whispered. "I needed you to," she replied, "because they took everything else. My name, my place, my story. They locked me away and told the world I was a lie. I brought you back," I said. "You kept me alive," she corrected. She stood and walked to the corner of the room, where the boards pulled back like petals opening to reveal a hollow. Inside was another jar, small, identical to the one I had opened. She placed it in my hands. "Now it's your turn," she said, "to be remembered." I looked down at the jar. There was no label, just my face reflected in the glass. She touched my forehead gently, like a mother blessing a child. "You'll forget this when you wake," she said, "but the jar will remember. The house will remember." Then the room unraveled, folding inward like burning paper. I awoke in bed, the sun pouring through the window. The jar was gone, but on the nightstand sat the leather-bound book I had seen before in the vault. I opened it. My name was still there. Below it, a new entry had appeared. He remembered what was meant to be forgotten, and so he was kept. I closed the book. Outside, the trees swayed again. Birds called. A breeze moved the curtains. The world had resumed. But the house remained the same, and I, the archivist, remained within it, remembering. The house had grown quiet again, but not in the way it once had, not the fearful silence of an entity holding its breath. This was a settled quiet, the kind that came when something had been accepted rather than denied. I moved through the rooms differently now. I didn't tread lightly or avoid the shadows. I moved with purpose, as though the walls expected me to, as though I was no longer a guest. The house didn't breathe around me. It listened. It learned. Each morning, I found a new jar on the mantel. They were never there the night before. I had stopped asking how or why. I simply recorded them. I had begun writing in the leather-bound ledger again, the one that had vanished after I found it in the vault and returned days later on my bedside table without explanation. The spiral on its cover was darker now, more defined, almost burned into the leather. The pages inside had rearranged. Some were torn, others rewritten. Every jar that appeared came with an entry, sometimes a name, sometimes only a feeling. But the handwriting, each time, was unmistakably mine. One morning, I found a jar labeled "Only Knocking." The wax was jet black, and beneath it, the faint imprint of a handprint. When I touched it, I didn't receive a memory as I had with others. Instead, I heard a single knock, deep resonant, like a hollow fist against the inside of a tomb. It rang in my ears for hours afterward. That night, something knocked at the back door. I didn't answer. Instead, I added the jar to the shelf in the sealed room and made a new entry in the ledger. Subject: knocking, unknown origin, reoccurring contact pattern. No entity observed, possibly residual. The writing appeared beneath my note a moment later in smaller script. Archivist note: do not open. It hadn't been written by me. I stared at the ink. It shimmered slightly as though still wet. The house was writing now, or the part of it that lived deeper, beneath the foundation, beneath the memory. It was speaking through the book, giving guidance, or perhaps warning. In the days that followed, more jars arrived, some accompanied by dreams, others by shifts in the air that made my skin ripple and the light bend slightly at the corners of my vision. I began to recognize the signs: a metallic taste in my mouth, a low, vibrating tension in the floorboards. These were precursors, heralds, the house's way of telling me something had arrived, something that didn't belong to this timeline, this world, or maybe even this reality. I named this collection the Arrival Ledger. The jars were different, heavier. They didn't hum. They watched. I felt it every time I turned my back. They pressed against the edges of perception, too quiet for the ear, too loud for the soul. One of them, shaped like a tall, thin urn, bore no label. Just a series of dashes carved along its base. Long, short, long, short. I realized, after an hour of staring, that it wasn't decoration. It was Morse code. I translated it carefully. I remember you too. It made no sense. And yet it made too much. I began to suspect that not all the jars came from lives lived. Some came from futures forgotten. Others from dreams that never finished. Some, I feared, came from things that never should have been. The ledger didn't differentiate. It simply received. I began to write less and observe more. The house was growing ahead of me, learning faster, expanding inward. I returned to the basement vault one evening. I hadn't gone back since the night the mirror shattered, but I was drawn there now. The spiral in the hallway pulsed faintly as I passed, as if urging me forward. The door opened without the key. The stairs descended as before, but the chamber had changed. There were people inside, not in body, in echo. They stood along the walls, transparent, flickering. Images burned into the stone. Each held a jar. Each turned to me in unison when I stepped into the room. I couldn't breathe. They weren't ghosts. They were the previous archivists. Their faces were not all human. One was veiled in shadow, its limbs elongated and crooked. Another shimmered like oil, faceless. A third appeared as a child made of bone and soot. But their eyes, all of them, were the same, silver. Remembering. They didn't speak, but I heard them. The house remembers what the world won't. We carry what you buried. Do not forget again. I fell to my knees. The jars around the room began to hum. And then, from the shadows, Ruth stepped forward. But it wasn't Ruth. Not anymore. She was older now, or maybe less human. Her body flowed like ink. Her mouth never moved, but I heard her voice in my spine. You've opened the ledger. Now it must be closed. I asked, why? She didn't answer. Instead, she held out a new jar. This one bore my name. No wax, only a lid. Inside was a spiral carved in bone. When I touched it, the memory flooded back. Not of Ruth, not of the house, but of everything I had forgotten before I ever came here. Moments scrubbed from my life. A sister who vanished when I was 5. A fire I started and didn't remember. A door I opened that never should have been real. I screamed. The echo filled the chamber. When I woke, I was in the sealed room. The new jar sat on the floor. The ledger was open on the desk beside me, and a new entry had appeared. Subject: Archivist number 17. Initiation complete. Underneath, a second note in Ruth's handwriting. He remembers now. Let him rest before the others arrive. And so I did. I lay in bed. The house watched over me. And outside, in the trees, I heard knocking again. Only once this time. But it wasn't asking to come in. It was warning me. They are coming. I didn't open the door. I didn't need to. The knock had said everything it needed to. It was final, almost courteous, an old signal, not of request, but of declaration. They were coming, and not in some abstract, mythic sense. They were real. They were near. The house felt it. I felt it. The jars responded first. The ones in the sealed room began to hum again, but the tones had shifted. It was no longer the solemn drone of memory or the quiet breath of stories wanting to be heard. This was urgent. This was alarm. Their sound filled the air with a high, rattling frequency like the wings of insects beneath skin. I could feel it in my teeth. I ran to the basement, unsure of what I thought I could do. The vault door stood open, waiting. The stairwell flickered with shadows not cast by any light I could see. The chamber had emptied. The archivists, those echoes of previous caretakers, were gone. Only the jars remained, glowing faintly, forming a spiral on the floor. My name pulsed at its center, etched into the stone. Beneath it, 3 more names had appeared, each unfamiliar. They shimmered like heat rising off pavement. The others, I returned upstairs. The cottage was shifting again. The walls seemed further apart, the hallway longer. The mirrors had all turned dark, but not blank. They now reflected a different house entirely. Familiar architecture, but broken. Worn, burned. I saw shadows move inside them, pacing from room to room, not watching me, but searching, preparing. I opened the ledger. New pages had filled in. The handwriting wasn't mine this time. It was sharp, angular, unnatural. They were forgotten. You remembered them, and now they returned to be remembered fully. Beneath it, a line in red ink. Do not open the door until the last jar has arrived. I turned the page. It was blank. I didn't know what that meant, the last jar. I had cataloged dozens. Some had arrived silently, some with dreams, some with blood, but none had ever come with warning. Not like this. I went from room to room, checking each shelf, each mantel, each crevice of the house where a jar might appear. And then, in the hearth, hidden behind the iron grate, tucked into the ashes, I found it. The final jar. It was different. Not because of the color or the material, but because it felt unfinished. It was cool in my hands, almost weightless. Inside, nothing. No object. No memory. No scent. It was not empty. It was waiting. There was no label. But on the underside of the jar, carved into the glass in faint, spiraling script, was a sentence. One must be unmade for the others to arrive. I didn't understand. Until the knock came again. This time from inside the house. 3 raps. Behind the sealed room's door. I froze. The jars on the shelves vibrated in unison, the spiral on the floor glowing faintly. I stepped toward the room, hand trembling, and opened the door. No one was inside, but something had changed. The floor was covered in salt, and at the center, a new jar, identical to the one I still held. It sat upright, humming softly, and from it rose a soft mist, curling in the air like smoke. When I stepped forward, my jar began to hum in response. I reached out. As soon as the 2 jars touched, the air imploded, not audibly, but with pressure, like the entire house had inhaled and refused to exhale. The mist twisted, solidified, and formed the outline of a figure. Tall, slender, faceless. It hovered for a moment, then stepped aside, revealing 2 more behind it. The others, they had come through. I didn't speak. I didn't run. I knew now what this was. I had not been chosen to remember them. I had been chosen to make space for them. The house, the jars, the sealed rooms. None of it was about preservation. It was about containment. And containment only worked as long as no one remembered. The spiral had been a map, a cycle. Every archivist added their weight to it, until one finally broke the pattern. And I had remembered Ruth. I had opened what should have stayed shut. I had recalled what even the house had tried to forget. The figures moved past me silently. Their presence hurt. It didn't bruise or cut, but the air around them warped. Light folded. Time bent. They weren't malicious. They were restorative. They were the memories that refused to die. The ones expelled from time itself. And now they had come back. To be recorded. To be known. To be felt. I followed them to the vault. The spiral was burning now, inscribed in fire on the stone floor. The ledger opened on its own. Pages turned violently. My name began to fade. Another name took its place. Archivist number 18. The 3 figures stood at the center of the spiral, and then they fell inward. Not dropped, not dragged, absorbed. The jars on the walls shattered in unison, each one unleashing a whisper, a sound like rain in reverse. It poured upward, into the spiral, into them. And then the light stopped. The noise stopped. Everything stilled. The vault was empty again, except for one new jar. It sat alone in the center of the chamber. Small, silver, sealed with no wax, no label, just a reflection. My face, but older, tired, and smiling. I picked it up and knew instantly this one would not be stored. It would be carried. Always. Because some memories are too heavy for the shelves. Some stories do not end with the archivist. They begin again each time someone knocks. I did not sleep after the silver jar appeared. I kept it with me, close, resting on the desk beside the ledger. It never made a sound, never pulsed, but it was warm and it carried a presence that was unmistakably mine, though not from this version of myself. Every time I looked into its mirrored surface, I saw a slightly different reflection. My posture shifted. My eyes were darker or lighter. Sometimes my hands looked older, worn. Other times I seemed younger, afraid. I began to understand. This was not just memory. It was possibility. All the selves I might have been had I never come to the house. Had I never remembered Ruth. Had I never opened the jar. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer the same quiet. It was not restful. It was watching. The very walls held still like lungs before a scream. The sealed room was empty, stripped bare of jars, markings, even dust. It had been used, fulfilled. Now it waited for what came next. Outside, the world was shifting. I felt it every time I opened a window or cracked the door to the porch. The trees were wrong. Too tall. Too silent. Their limbs didn't move, even in wind. There was wind, but it only blew inward toward the house, never out. I tried to write in the ledger, but the pages turned before my hand reached them. They flipped to a blank spread near the back, and a single sentence wrote itself in ink that bloomed slowly like a bruise. The spiral does not end where it began. It ends outside. I stepped onto the porch. The morning was still. Fog rolled low over the path, curling between tree trunks like it had a mind of its own. I brought the jar with me. The silver caught no reflection now. It had turned dull, almost matte, as if it were adjusting to the light. I took a step forward. Gravel crunched beneath my shoes. The trees stood still. I walked beyond the edge of the clearing and onto the old trail that used to lead to the main road. But the path no longer went where it should. It sloped downward. It wasn't a metaphorical descent. It physically descended. The woods thickened as I walked. Branches closed above me like a cathedral ceiling. There were no birds, no insects, no rustle of leaves, only the soft sound of my own footfalls and the quiet hum of the jar in my hand. It had begun to vibrate softly, not a warning, a pull, as though it was guiding me forward. I began to see markings on the trees. At first, they were carved spirals, like the ones from the sealed room. But as I continued deeper, they changed. Some were sigils, symbols I didn't recognize. Others were just names, carved over and over until the bark wept sap like blood. One tree bore a single word across its trunk, forget. I reached the clearing by midday, or what felt like midday. There was no sun overhead. The sky had turned a dull grayish white, as if painted over. At the center of the clearing stood a stone platform, low and cracked, etched with a spiral that spiraled outward instead of inward. That alone made my chest tighten. It was reversed. The platform had been used before. I saw the remains, burned wax, shattered glass, rusted chains. It was a ritual site, a breach point, where the spiral once released instead of contained. The jar in my hand grew heavier. I stepped onto the platform. The air thickened around me. The fog that clung to the forest floor rose upward in a slow cyclone, surrounding the circle. My ears rang. My skin prickled. The ground beneath me throbbed with a pulse not mine. I placed the jar at the center of the outward spiral. Nothing happened. For a moment. Then the spiral flared. Not with fire. With memory. It burst from the ground in invisible waves, scenes, feelings, fragments. My childhood. Ruth's room. The vault. The forest. All of it layered over one another like 1,000 transparencies. And beneath it all them, the others, the archivists, the forgotten. I saw their faces emerge from the trees, half-formed, flickering, like memories being remembered wrong. They were not approaching. They were gathering. I knelt. The jar began to hum. Then the sky cracked. It didn't thunder. It fractured. A single fissure ran from horizon to horizon, splitting the sky like broken porcelain. And through it, light, not warm or golden, but white and pulsing, as though behind it was a giant eye opening. The spiral had been reversed. It was not drawing memory inward. It was pushing it out. Every story that had been kept, every secret jarred and buried, every voice once silenced. They surged through the crack like a wave, intangible and endless. I felt them fill the woods, the air, the house even from afar. And I realized then, with perfect clarity, what my role had been all along. The archivist does not protect the house. The archivist prepares the world. This was not a haunting. It was a release. The house had contained them long enough. The spiral was always meant to break, because forgetting was never permanent. Eventually, everything remembered itself, even the ones time had tried to erase. The jar at the center of the spiral cracked. Light seeped from it, soft and steady, and from within, I heard my own voice, a younger version, whispering a name, not mine, Ruth. And then the jar shattered. The spiral burned itself into the stone. The clearing emptied, and I was alone. But the silence was different now. It was not waiting. It was witnessing. The world remembered. And the others had returned. I returned to the house with mud on my boots and ash on my sleeves. The spiral in the clearing had burned itself into the soles of my feet, or at least it felt that way. Each step back along the crooked trail echoed with memory, as though the path itself repeated what I'd done with every footfall. I could feel the others behind me, not chasing, not following exactly, but lingering, absorbed into the bones of the woods and the breath of the wind. I didn't look back. I didn't have to. The air was saturated with presence. The house was waiting. When I opened the door, the lights were already on. All of them. Every lamp, every overhead bulb, even the string of half-dead fairy lights I had strung across the staircase months ago. They all glowed, and yet no shadows were cast. The light filled every corner without resistance, as if the darkness had fled before I arrived. On the kitchen table, the ledger lay open, untouched. The last page bore only one sentence, written in my own hand. They are no longer memories. The room was warm, but the warmth felt unfamiliar, like walking into a stranger's house that looked exactly like your own. The walls had shifted again. Subtly, the hallway had grown narrower. The ceilings lower. The space no longer existed in conventional dimensions. It wasn't smaller. It was more focused, every inch a chamber of thought. I entered the sealed room, expecting to find it empty again, but someone was sitting in the chair. Ruth. Not the ageless version I had seen in the vault. Not the shadow-wrapped figure who had guided me through dreams. This was Ruth as she had been in the photograph I found months ago, young still, with large eyes and braided hair. She looked up at me as though I just entered a classroom late. "You made it back," she said softly. "I never really left," I replied. She nodded. "You carried me. Even before you knew my name." She gestured to the shelf where the jars used to be. It was empty now, except for a single object resting at the center, a mirror. Not the warped one from the hallway. This was older, smaller, handheld. The back was etched in silver filigree, and the glass was dark. I picked it up. My reflection didn't look like me. It looked like every version of me I'd seen in the jar. Young, old, frightened, furious, silent. They all moved independently. Not synchronized. Not controlled. Just present. "They're not inside the jars anymore," I said. Ruth shook her head. "No, they're outside now. In the world. Remembered." I placed the mirror back on the shelf. "What happens to me?" I asked. "You're still the archivist," she said. "But the role has changed. The world doesn't forget the way it used to. The spiral's opened. They're not coming to you anymore. They're being lived." I understood. The house had been a womb, a vault, a sanctuary for the discarded, for stories too dangerous to live. But now those stories had found form again, reattached themselves to people, places, histories. The things long denied were taking root in real time. The others had not come to haunt. They had come to inhabit. I asked her, "So what am I supposed to do now?" She smiled. "Now you listen." And with that, she vanished. The house dimmed. Not in darkness, in mood, like it had exhaled for the first time in centuries. I walked the rooms. Every surface told a story now, not in objects or markings, but in feeling. The floorboards near the front door buzzed faintly, echoing the laughter of a child who used to sneak past curfew. The walls in the upstairs hallway held heat where someone once pressed their head in grief. The mirror in the bathroom showed not my reflection, but the moment someone decided to let go of who they were. I no longer needed jars. The stories were everywhere. The house had remembered everything. But now the world outside had begun remembering too. I sat at the desk and opened a new book. Blank. No spiral on the cover. No sigils. Just leather and paper. I wrote the date, then a name, then a moment I had never lived but now knew. A woman burying a small tin in her garden. A man waking in the snow with someone else's name in his mouth. A child who whispered truth to mirrors no one else could see. The ledger had become a seed, and I had become its sower. Outside, the woods breathed, not in menace, in relief, as if something vast and unseen had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone could imagine. The reversal of the spiral, the collapse of containment, the return of memory. I stepped out onto the porch one last time. It was morning, real morning. Birdsong filled the air. The wind moved naturally, lifting the trees in slow motion like dancers. At the edge of the forest stood 3 figures. Not Ruth, not the others. People. Real. Each holding something in their hands, a notebook, a photograph, a jar made of clay. They were coming up the path, drawn here by their own remembering. I did not call out. I did not prepare tea. I simply opened the door and let them in. They told me their stories. I wrote them down. And somewhere, far beneath the house, the spiral burned in quiet satisfaction. The first visitor's name was Thomas. He was in his 60s, lean and hunched, his hands rough with old work, the kind of man who still wore button-down shirts even when visiting strangers. He said nothing at first, simply handed me a photograph as I opened the door. It was weathered, nearly crumbling at the corners. In it, a girl with her hair pulled tight stood in front of a farmhouse that no longer existed. Her eyes were almost familiar. I invited him in. He sat at the kitchen table without needing to be asked, as though he'd been there before in another life. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to introduce himself. She kept the fire going for 3 nights, he said, after we'd all left. She said the cold couldn't take her memory if it stayed warm. I didn't know the context. I didn't need it. The story pulsed in the air like old perfume, lingering, still heavy. I recorded the memory in the new book. No need for ink. The words came without effort, my hand guided by something more enduring than thought. He stayed until dusk, said little, left the photograph behind. When he walked back into the woods, I knew I'd never see him again. But his story remained. That same evening, a girl came, no older than 16. Shoes scuffed, shoulders square like she was daring the world to shove her again. She didn't knock, just stood on the porch until I noticed her through the window. She held a notebook against her chest like armor. When I opened the door, she didn't speak. She walked straight to the sealed room, as if it had been calling her all her life. I followed. She stood at the threshold, looking around, her jaw tight. "This is where they took it from me," she said at last. I asked what it was. "Name," she said. "Not mine. His." She sat in the center of the floor and opened the notebook. It was full page after page, hand-drawn maps, sketches of faces, fragments of conversations written in block letters. Near the back, one page had been torn out. She handed it to me. On it, a single line. "He never drowned. They just stopped looking." She didn't stay long. She didn't cry. But as she left, she whispered to the doorway, "I kept it safe. Like you asked." I returned to the desk and added a new entry to the ledger. I didn't know her name. She never offered it. But the spiral accepted her story all the same. When I closed the book, the room exhaled. They came more frequently after that. An old woman with a tin of soil from her childhood home, insisting it had once been buried beneath a church that no longer existed. A man with burn scars who said he used to dream of a house with no doors and too many windows. A mute boy who carried a stone and laid it on the porch, pointing at it as if it had something to say. I took it in, all of it. Each moment, each object, each memory offered without explanation. The ledger grew heavier. and the house grew brighter. Not in light, but in presence. It filled out, thickened, like a painting being repainted from memory. The cracks in the walls softened. The rooms that had once been too large or too narrow began to find natural shape. Even the mirrors returned to proper reflection, though sometimes, if I looked too long, I would catch glimpses of other archivists, seated across their own desks in different houses, writing the same entries I had just recorded. The spiral connected us. Always had. One afternoon, the post arrived. I hadn't received a letter in months, perhaps longer. Time didn't behave the same way anymore. But there it was, a plain envelope slipped beneath the door. No stamp, no address. Inside, a single sheet. You were not the last. Below that, a list of names. Some I recognized. Some I felt rather than remembered. Some were mine, previous versions, alternate selves. Might have beens. I added them all to the ledger. That night, the silver jar returned. I found it resting on the pillow where my head had lain. This time, it wasn't empty. Inside, something shimmered, a miniature spiral, slowly turning, made of light. I opened the jar carefully, half expecting to be drawn in. But the light held, and from it came a voice. It wasn't Ruth's. It wasn't mine. It was a chorus, dozens, maybe hundreds of voices layered into one. "We are remembering the world," it said. "Keep writing." I whispered back. "Why me?" The spiral spun faster. "You remembered first." I didn't sleep that night. I wrote. 4 hours. Days. The pages turned by themselves now. The ledger no longer needed me to guide it, only to witness. I was no longer an archivist in the old sense. I wasn't preserving memory in secret. I was broadcasting it. The spiral had shifted from storage to signal. Somewhere beyond the forest, people were waking with dreams not their own. Children remembered lullabies they'd never been taught. Old women spoke names long lost to their family trees. And the ones who had been buried, not in earth, but in silence, began to rise. Not as ghosts, as truths. By the end of the week, the path to the house had worn into a wide track. They came in groups now. Some brought objects. Some brought memories. Some brought nothing at all. Just the aching sense that something important had been missing inside them all their lives. I opened the door for each one. And I listened. Because I knew the house didn't need me to keep it alive anymore. The world was the house now. And every story was a brick in the new foundation. The spiral outside had started turning. And it wasn't stopping. By the third week, the house no longer closed its doors. There was no need. The threshold had become symbolic, an open mouth that spoke without words, a welcome that reached beyond sound. People came without invitation and left without goodbye. I stopped asking who had sent them. The answer was always the same, whether spoken aloud or held behind the eyes. I don't know, I just felt like I needed to come here. I began to wonder if the house still sat in the same location I had first arrived. The woods remained, but they had thickened, rearranged themselves. The road had vanished completely. I hadn't seen a single car or heard a plane overhead in weeks. Yet people still found the house. They emerged from the trees, from fog, from places that didn't exist on any map I'd ever seen. One man said he walked in from the desert. Another swore he had boarded a bus in Chicago and got off here, though the air smelled like salt and moss. Geography had unraveled itself in service of something more important, remembrance. The silver jar remained on the desk, unchanged since the spiral of light had appeared. It no longer pulsed, no longer hummed. It simply watched. Each time I passed it, I felt something shift, not inside the jar, but inside me. A subtle tightening behind the ribs, a flicker of sensation in the jaw. It was like standing beside a lifelong friend and realizing, after years, that you had never truly known them. And now you couldn't look away. The ledger had begun writing on its own. It filled page after page in my handwriting, sometimes in languages I didn't know. Hebrew, Latin, symbols that came from no alphabet I recognized. The names poured out, names buried in war and flood and lies. Some had never been spoken aloud until now. Some had been stolen. Some had been erased deliberately. The ledger remembered all of them. One morning, I found a single sheet of paper pinned to the wall above my bed. You are not the final hand, only the first to open it. It was not signed, but I knew who had left it. The house, the spiral, the collective memory that had used my voice to echo back into the world. It was no longer just about recording. It was about returning. I began to see it in the people who came. A girl who had never spoken suddenly sang an old folk song no one else in the room recognized, but all of us felt. An elderly man who had never known his parents wept when handed a photograph by a woman who had never been to his country. Two strangers embraced as if reunited after decades, though neither claimed to remember the other. Memory was no longer linear. It folded, turned inward, nested within other lives. The spiral lived in all of them now. One afternoon, a boy, no older than 10, approached me with a wooden box. He didn't say a word, just placed it in my lap. When I opened it, I found a single small clay jar, unfired, fragile. It had no lid. Inside it was a lock of hair, and a name written in charcoal on the underside. I never meant to forget her. He didn't wait for me to respond. He left as silently as he had arrived. But the jar remained. I placed it on the shelf in the sealed room, though that name no longer fit. It was open now. Walls knocked down, floors swept clean. People moved through it as they pleased. The spiral etched on the floor had deepened, worn in from footsteps. It was not just a room anymore. It was an altar, a library, a womb. They came at night too. People I didn't know. People I didn't think were alive. One evening, I woke to find a woman standing by the fireplace. She didn't look at me. She simply held her hands over the flames, humming a lullaby I remembered from my dreams. Ruth's lullaby. I asked her name. She said I had one. I gave it away so she could speak again. She disappeared before morning, but her presence lingered. Everywhere I walked, I found remnants of visitors I never saw. New jars placed gently in corners. Words carved softly into furniture. Names whispered into the window panes that fogged up even when there was no breath. The world outside changed as well. I no longer recognized the sky. The stars had rearranged themselves into spirals. At night, the wind carried not leaves, but pages, small scraps of parchment drifting between the trees. I read them when I could. Most were names. Some were apologies. Some were confessions never spoken aloud. One simply read, "Do you remember me yet?" I did. All of them. The archivist had no end, no death, only handing over. I realized then that the jar on my desk, the one with the spiral light, was not a container. It was a torch, and I would have to pass it on. The next archivist was already on their way. Maybe they had already arrived. Maybe they were watching from the tree line. Maybe they had written something into the ledger without me knowing. The house didn't need me anymore. But I remained because I wanted to. Because for the first time in my life, the act of remembering had made me feel more real than forgetting ever had. And I wasn't afraid. Because the spiral didn't devour. It revealed. The weight of memory was not a burden when it was shared. It became a foundation, place to stand. And if you listen closely, through the jars, through the trees, through the walls of every forgotten house, you will hear it still turning. I awoke to silence, but not emptiness. The kind of silence that follows a story well told, a silence that waits. The silver jar had gone cold in the night. Its glow faded, its surface dull, as though it had finally finished speaking. I touched it and felt no pulse, no hum. For the first time since the spiral revealed itself, the house felt still. The sealed room was empty, not abandoned. The ledger lay open to a blank page. I sat beside it for hours, pen in hand, unable to write a single word. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I had begun to understand what could not be said. Some stories defied the shape of language. They pulsed beneath words, not through them. They lived in breath, in memory, in the tremor of hands that tried to describe what eyes had seen but minds refused to process. These were the unspoken records. The ledger had no page for them. But the house did. I wandered, not aimlessly, but without purpose. I moved through the rooms like a priest moving through a sanctuary. The wallpaper had peeled in places, revealing not brick or wood, but layers of paint shaped like words. Tiny inscriptions. Entire paragraphs barely visible unless light caught the walls at just the right angle. I began to notice them everywhere. Behind the stove, beneath the window frames, along the seams of the floorboards. The stories that had never been written into the ledger had been inscribed into the body of the house itself. I traced one with my finger and immediately felt the memory. A man hiding in a coal bin during a raid, whispering a promise to someone who would never return. A little girl burying a locket in a bread box so her family would always have a piece of her when they had to flee. A woman locking herself in a church basement with a suitcase full of letters she was too afraid to mail. None of them had names. None of them asked for anything. They simply were. The house was an archive beyond the limits of time. I returned to the kitchen and found the mirror above the sink had changed. It no longer reflected the room. It reflected rooms, other versions of this place, lived in by other archivists, each carrying out the same role in different forms. One of them was reading. One was painting. One was sleeping, surrounded by jars. I watched them for a long time, wondering if they could see me too. If we were all just pages in the same spiraled book. That night, I stepped outside and walked deeper into the forest than I had ever dared before. There was no trail, no markers, but I knew where I was going. I followed a sound, not footsteps, not wind. It was the sound of breath, not human, not animal. The breath of memory, thick and quiet and constant. I came upon a clearing I had never seen before. At its center stood a tree, massive, ancient, its bark gnarled with spiral carvings. The ground beneath it was soft, mossy, and scattered with fragments of paper. I bent to pick one up. It disintegrated in my hand, but before it did, I saw a name. Thomas, one of the first visitors. Another fragment bore a line. She waited by the well for 7 winters. I realized this was where the stories came when they no longer needed to be carried. This was the forgetting, not as erasure, but as release. They had been remembered. That was enough. I knelt at the base of the tree and placed the silver jar there. Its light had gone out, but it still held weight. It was not an object now. It was a marker of what had passed, of what had been witnessed. I whispered a name I had never spoken before, my own, and then I stood and walked away. When I returned to the house, the spiral on the floor had shifted. It had begun to unravel. The lines were pulling apart, stretching outward, expanding into something looser, more open. It was no longer a containment circle. It had become a path. The visitors had stopped coming, not because the stories had ended, but because they no longer needed a place to be told. The world was remembering on its own. The spiral had gone global. Every whispered name, every found object, every half-recalled dream added a brick to the invisible cathedral of memory that now pulsed over the horizon. I began closing the rooms, one by one, not locking them, not sealing, just pausing them, letting them rest. The kitchen returned to quiet. The hallway mirror showed only me. The sealed room grew warm again, sunlight pooling through the window. I no longer needed to record every memory. Some lived now in the minds of those who would carry them away. Some lived in mine. Some had found peace. The ledger remained open. The single phrase now filled its final page. When you're ready, leave it open. The next hand will find it. I went to sleep that night without fear. No dreams came. Just the hush of a house finally allowed to be quiet. Not forgotten. Not erased. But full. Like a story told all the way to the end and left open on the last page. Waiting. Because stories, like houses, are never truly finished. The days became gentle. Not in their weather or events, those no longer followed any schedule I could name, but in the way the house moved with me. It creaked in comfort, not in warning. Its silence was no longer expectant, but companionable. There was no longer the sense of something waiting behind walls or beneath floorboards. It had all come out. Everything that had once pressed against the seams of the cottage had been given voice. The rooms now breathed like lungs finally allowed to rest. I began waking early, not because the house called me, but because I wanted to hear it breathe before anyone else did. The light through the east windows changed from gold to pale gray, and back again, depending on the memory it passed through. I no longer questioned it. I simply followed the color as I made coffee, took small walks around the garden, and dusted shelves that no longer bore jars but folded pieces of cloth, pages of music, and unmarked stones. gifts left behind by those who had come and gone. One morning, I found the door to the attic open. I hadn't been up there in weeks. Not since the spiral reversed and the vault below became quiet. I hesitated at the bottom of the ladder, unsure if something waited above. But there was no pull, no hum, just a sense of curiosity. I climbed. The attic was full of light. Filtered through a circular window, I didn't remember being there. Sunlight pooled across the floor in a perfect circle, and within it sat a small wooden box. The rest of the attic was unchanged. Dust-covered trunks, old chairs, the shape of time holding still, but that box felt new, like it had only just arrived. I knelt and opened it. Inside was a key. Not ornate, not ancient, just simple brass, cool to the touch. Tied to it was a note written in firm handwriting that wasn't mine. You'll know when it's time. No signature. No explanation. Just the key. I took it downstairs and placed it beside the ledger. I didn't recognize what door it belonged to, and I didn't need to. The house would tell me, or if the next person would know. That was the point. The story had shifted. I was no longer the center of it. That evening, the wind changed. It blew from the west, carrying the smell of salt water and smoke, two scents that had never belonged to this place. I stood on the porch and watched the tree lean bend slightly as if bowing. A shape emerged just past the edge of the woods. A young woman walking steadily, her coat torn at one shoulder, carrying a suitcase and a glass jar wrapped in cloth. She didn't knock. She looked at me, and I understood. This was the next one. She had the look I remembered seeing in myself in mirrors I didn't recognize, a hunger to understand, to contain, to serve something greater than herself. I stepped aside, and she entered. She didn't ask questions. She didn't speak. She walked directly to the sealed room, now the spiral room, and placed her jar at the center. It began to hum. The sound was low, melodic. Not memory. Not mourning. A beginning. She turned to me and said only one thing. You kept it alive. Then she walked into the study, sat where I had sat, opened the ledger, and began reading. I left her there. I returned to the attic and stood beneath the circle of light, holding the key. I didn't know what came next. Maybe another house. Maybe a deeper memory. Maybe nothing at all. I had served my time, not as punishment, but as purpose. And I had been changed by it. The world was remembering now. I could feel it in the way people looked at one another on the road when they passed, in the way children hummed songs no one had taught them, in the way old buildings seemed to hold on a little longer before collapsing, waiting for someone to notice. Not all stories would come to the house anymore. And not all stories needed to. They were leaking into the soil, into the bones of the earth. The spiral was not only a path inward. It was a map across the world. I packed a small bag, a notebook, a few pens, a cracked jar filled with dried flowers that had no name. I didn't write a goodbye in the ledger. That wasn't how this worked. The house would know. The woman would know. And whoever came after her would know too. I left through the back door. The path into the trees had shifted again, but I recognized the way. The spiral in my chest, once tight and binding, had uncoiled. I no longer felt the ache of forgotten things pressing against my ribs. I felt space, breath, a readiness to carry memory differently. Not as weight, but as light. Before I vanished into the trees, I turned once more. The house stood quiet, lit from within, its windows open, its mirrors clear. And I knew without doubt that it would outlive me, because the memory never ends. It only changes hands. The forest swallowed me without malice. Each step forward folded the past behind me, the house retreating into the trees not with loss, but with grace. It did not vanish. I knew it remained where it always had been, wherever it had always needed to be. Memory doesn't disappear. It simply finds new vessels. The path before me was crooked, unmarked, yet somehow familiar. It did not wind toward any place I could name, but every breath I took whispered to me that I had been walking it all my life. I did not know how long I walked. The sun didn't rise or fall in any recognizable pattern. Time had loosened its hold on me, and I welcomed the drift. I passed through places that didn't exist on maps, abandoned gardens still tended by unseen hands, bridges that led only into reflection, windows set into the trunks of trees that showed rooms from dreams I never admitted having. In one grove, I found dozens of shoes, each worn and mud-kicked, laid out in a spiral. I left mine among them and walked on barefoot. The world was remembering. And everywhere I looked, the signs were there. In a child's chalk drawing on the cracked concrete of a ghost town gas station, I saw the spiral. In the static between radio frequencies as I passed a rusted tower, I heard a voice humming Ruth's lullaby. On a beach where the tide never moved, names had been written into the sand in dozens of languages. They never washed away. The sea was listening. I reached a town one evening, a quiet place of stone and shuttered windows, surrounded by fields where nothing grew. The people didn't look at me, but they all stepped aside. One by one, they each placed something outside their doors. A ribbon, a photograph, a page torn from a journal. All unspoken offerings to someone who understood the shape of forgetting. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. The spiral had passed through here before. It was still coiled beneath the earth, warming the silence with stories waiting to bloom. In the center of the town stood a church. Its spire had collapsed, but the doors remained. I stepped inside. The pews were covered in dust, the altar bare. But above the pulpit, where once there may have been a cross, was a carved circle, open at one edge, a spiral incomplete, or simply still moving. I sat in the first pew, and there beside me lay a book. Not the ledger, but a book like it. Blank, waiting. I picked it up. My hands moved on their own, and I began again. Not from the beginning, but from the present. There was once a house that remembered what the world tried to forget. I wrote into the night, and the words spilled easily. The pages turned of their own accord. The ink never ran dry. I wrote every story that had no place, every name that had gone unspoken, every moment that had died in silence because no one dared to hold it. And as I wrote, I knew I was no longer writing for myself or even for the house. I was writing for the ones who would never make it to the cottage in the woods, the ones who whispered their stories into pillows, the ones who died with names no one spoke again, the ones who still wait in the corners of photographs to be recognized. The spiral had taught me this. Remembering is an act of love, not perfection, not chronology, not clarity, but presence. I wrote until my hands ached, and when I looked up, the church was filled, not with people, but with echoes. Figures sat in the pews, faint, flickering, each one holding a jar. Some glowed, some were broken, some were sealed tightly with wax that trembled under breath. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their stories had been written. They were home. I stood and placed the book on the altar. The spiral above me pulsed once softly, a promise fulfilled. I walked outside and found that the town had disappeared. In its place was a field of tall grass, swaying in wind that hummed in harmony. The world was whole again, not clean, not simple, but whole. Because it remembered. And I knew finally what Ruth had become. Not a ghost, not a warning, but a seed. She had buried herself in the minds of the willing until someone gave her a voice again. I had been the first to listen, but I would not be the last. Somewhere in another town, in another forest, someone would find a spiral carved into a sidewalk or stitched into a coat pocket. They'd feel a pull, a whisper, a weight they couldn't name. They'd follow it, and the story would begin again. Not the same, never the same, because the spiral never closes. It only turns, and so I walk still, not away, but forward, carrying what must not be forgotten, leaving behind what has found peace, listening, always,